Hi guys, if you're new to South Florida gardening or just want to know more about tropical fruit, I'd like to share some of my experiences with what have been my most successful fruit producers in my home garden. I moved into my house about 6 years ago, and I had a few goals as to what I would put in my garden. First off, I wanted fruit that is relatively exotic. I was most interested in things you can't easily find in your corner grocery store, and also won't cost you an arm and a leg. Second, I wanted things that would produce large crops. I mean, how disappointing is it when you go through a whole growing season and only get to pick a few fruit? Next, I wanted a young producer. I do have some trees that are coming up on 4 years old that still haven't even flowered yet. Those will not be on this list. Everything here can produce fruit within 2 years of planting from no larger than a 3-gallon pot. I also wanted plants that are relatively easy to grow. Some of these check the box of literally thriving on neglect, but all generally don't have many pest or fungus issues to deal with. Finally, I was looking for compact growers. This can depend on how much space you have, but I wanted to try and fit as many things as I could in my yard, which means I was looking for plants that don't get huge, or at least which you can prune to manageable sizes. Before I start, I just want to note a couple other points. One thing you should not be growing in Florida, which may surprise those new to Florida gardening, is citrus. Florida is no longer the orange state. California actually produces 92% of all citrus in America, and this is due to the unfortunate citrus greening disease, which has spread throughout Florida. Once a tree is infected, there is no cure. Citrus greening is spread by an insect called the Asian citrus psyllid. And once infected, trees produce fruits that are green, misshapen, and bitter, and most infected trees die within a few years. Because of this, Florida's citrus industry has actually reduced nearly 94% in the last 20 years. Right when I moved in, I knew nothing about this, and I did try growing a tangelo tree, but it got infested with the Asian citrus psyllid. I did try battling it for a couple years before I decided to bite the bullet and just chop it down. I now have that spot replaced with a loquat tree and pineapple plants, which, spoiler alert, are 2 plants I have on this list. One more thing to note is that the new king of fruit in South Florida is clearly the mango. Mango trees are everywhere around here and produce amazingly. I have 4 trees in my backyard alone. Being that mangoes are so popular here and there are literally hundreds of varieties with all different characteristics, I won't be including them on this list, but a mango tree is clearly the #1 fruit to grow in South Florida. So with all that said, let's finally get this list going. Since I already brought up loquat, I'll start with this one. There are a lot of great qualities about loquat trees. I bought a 3-gallon loquat tree and it produced a handful of fruit only 10 months later. Loquat trees are fast growers and are not demanding. I've never fertilized mine and only water it very occasionally. They generally don't have any issues, but I have had to deal with some aphids and caterpillars, which can do some cosmetic damage to leaves. Loquats are a really good eating fruit. They taste kind of like an apricot with a nice sweet and tart flavor. Another nice thing is they are a spring producer, ripening between March and May when not much else is ripening. And finally, loquats are a very attractive tree. They grow into a very nice canopy with their big dark green leaves and beautiful fragrant white flowers. They are actually commonly grown as landscape trees without people even knowing that they produce delicious fruit. So the next fruit I recommend are pineapples. Pineapples are a really cool fruit to grow. I have pineapple plants growing all over my yard, and I never once actually bought a pineapple plant. All of my plants started from cutting off the top of a store-bought pineapple and just sticking them in the dirt. It really takes no effort, and the pineapple tops will pretty much grow in any condition. And even better, the plants are the definition of thriving on neglect. I have never once fertilized or even watered them. After about 2 years, they will produce the first lone fruit along with a bunch of little suckers. You can just leave the suckers and each should produce another fruit the following year, or you can remove the suckers and replant them and they'll easily grow into new plants. After a few years, the single plant will have multiplied with the suckers and look something like this. I now get multiple fruit from each plant every year. They also give the landscape a nice tropical look, so I highly recommend growing pineapples. The next one I recommend is papaya. The papaya tree looks kind of like a palm tree, but it actually isn't a tree at all. It's a vegetative plant. The trunk is hollow and fleshy, and it doesn't branch out, so it takes up very little space. The first papaya tree that I bought was a small potted red lady variety, which gave me the first fruit only 11 months later. I ended up picking about 50 to 60 papayas before the tree suddenly died. I'm not quite sure why. One of the cool things about papaya trees is that the seeds sprout super fast and will grow into a new tree, possibly fruiting within a year from the seed. This is actually how I got my second tree. I I sprouted it from a bunch of seeds from a fruit from my first tree. If you're sprouting seeds, there are two things to keep in mind. First, except for some rare hermaphrodite trees, papaya trees are either male or female with distinctly different flowers, and only the female trees will bear fruit. The good thing though is that they flower fast, so you should know the sex pretty quickly, but it's still wise to sprout many seeds at a time, just to be sure you get a female from one of them. Second, papayas don't grow true to seed, so the fruit you get from the seedling could be good or it could be bad. The fruit I got from my seedling wasn't great, and in fact I didn't like it enough to keep the tree, so I cut it down. I actually just recently bought another small potted red lady, so I'm looking forward to having more papayas in less than a year, hopefully. Alright, on to the next one, and if you've seen some of my earlier videos, this is one of my favorites. I highly recommend Sapodilla. Sapodillas are also called Nispero or Chiku, and they're pretty popular in Latin America, but fairly unknown in the rest of America, although I don't know why. Sapodillas are one of my favorite fruits. They taste like a pear soaked in brown sugar, and have an intensely sweet molasses-like flavor. Sapodillas can grow into huge trees, but there are also dwarf varieties, and the one variety I recommend here is the Silas wood. The Silas wood is a dwarf, and it's an incredibly prolific producer at a very young age. I got my Silas wood in a 3-gallon pot here, and had my first crop less than 2 years later when the tree was only about 3.5 feet tall. My tree is still only about 4 feet tall, and it's full of fruit. It's definitely one of my best producers and one of my favorite trees in my yard. So the next tree I recommend for South Florida is the banana. Now you may be saying, hey, you said you wouldn't recommend a fruit you can get in the grocery store. Yeah, the thing is there are varieties of bananas you can easily grow that are just in a different league than store-bought bananas. One of the more popular varieties for home growing, and the variety that I have in my backyard, is the Namwa. Bananas, like papayas, are also not trees, but large vegetative plants. The trunk will grow for about a year or two before flowering and then producing a crop of bananas. These crops in my yard have produced about 130 bananas each. Banana plants are like pineapples where they continuously grow offshoots called pups. You can leave the pups growing, which will grow into new trunks and produce more bananas, or you can dig them out and move them and they'll grow into a brand new plant. Pups are incredibly easy to grow. You only want about 3 or 4 main trunks at a time. I actually cut them off and throw them into the bushes and they start rooting from just laying right on the ground. So my recommendation would be to find someone with a tree that you like and ask them for a pup to transplant to your yard. Hell, if anyone wants a Namwa pup for free, just hit me up. The Namwas, also nicknamed ice cream bananas, are incredibly sweet with a dense and creamy texture, absolutely nothing like a boring store-bought banana. Just be careful because under good conditions, the plant could get out of control with all the new pups, so you'll need to keep cutting them down to keep it manageable. So the next tree I recommend is called the Muntingia calabura. Although this goes by some other names, most commonly it's referred to as the Jamaican cherry or the strawberry tree, and also sometimes the cotton candy fruit. For all the positives about this tree, there's one big thing you need to know, and that's a big thing. It grows big and it grows fast. This tree can grow up to 10 feet in 1 year. It grows big weeping branches with little blueberry-sized berries hanging down, which could be yellow or red depending on the variety. I got my yellow Jamaican cherry off Amazon and it came as a little tiny twig. I picked my first fruit less than a year later, and now 2 years later it has turned into this giant weeping tree in the corner of my yard. The fruit tastes like little bursts of sugar. Some compare them to cotton candy or Captain Crunch cereal. They kind of have their own distinct flavor, but definitely very sweet. They fruit almost year-round, and especially in the summer when the tree is just loaded with these little things. I picked a bunch of fruit last summer, only a year and a half after I got that little tiny twig. I also planted it in the worst spot of my yard. It doesn't get much light back in the corner. It's surrounded by the thick roots of the ficus hedge and an old black olive tree trunk right there. I've never fertilized it or watered it, and it's still thriving. So yeah, a definitely good one if you have the space and the effort to keep pruning it. Next on this list is the figs. When I tell people that I grow figs, a common response I get is, figs? Why figs? And then I say, have you ever had a fresh fig? And they say, no, I don't think so. And there you go. Fresh figs are up there with some of the best fruit in the world. Unfortunately, they have a very short shelf life, so they're very hard to find in the stores fresh. Fortunately, they grow very well and produce lots of fruit fast. If you're in South Florida, the only thing you'll need to be aware of is they are susceptible to root knot nematodes. These nematodes are microscopic worms that live in the warm Florida soil and feed off the roots of certain plant species. They cause root knots or galls and lead to the decline of the plant. Before I knew about this, I did plant a fig tree in the ground, and sure enough, its health declined and I found the galls on the roots. I now keep my figs in pots where they thrive in some good potting soil. When kept well watered and fertilized, my figs gave bountiful harvests in their first year. For these reasons, I highly recommend figs if you have limited space, as they can be kept small in pots and give you lots of delicious fruit. The last fruit on my list is passion fruit. Passion fruit grows on an incredibly fast-growing vine, so before you decide to try growing it, make sure you have the space for a prolific, bushy vine. A long, sturdy fence is ideal, or you can build your own trellis system. I bought a tiny plant on Amazon, and in only 6 months, it completely covered my entire pool fence and began flowering. Passion fruits have an amazing tropical flavor and are a delight to eat, but the underrated highlight of this plant are the flowers. Just look at these things. If you want to keep your vine under control, you'll need to do periodic pruning. I think I pruned mine way too hard at once, and the plant unfortunately ended up dying. I needed to do some fence repair, so I didn't grow another one, but I'd like to again soon. So that wraps up the fruits that I've personally had success with. One more honorable mention that I'll include is the starfruit, or the carambola. Based on what I've read and from personally observing other trees in the neighborhood, starfruit trees easily produce huge crops of fruit on very small trees. The only reason I have not grown one yet is because I just find the fruit okay tasting. However, it's currently starfruit season, and there's some small trees in my neighborhood that are just full of fruit, and that made me decide to just buy a tree, which I just did on this day of recording. I bought myself a Cherry starfruit tree. So hopefully on one of my next videos, I'll show you how it looks, and I'll be planting it in my yard. So that's what I recommend if you want to grow your own fruit in South Florida. Let me know in the comments below if you have anything else to add based on your experiences. I'd love to hear about other easy fruits to grow here in South Florida. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.